Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Today, we are going to continue our introduction to the Ottoman Empire. And what we are going to think about is how to classify all the different peoples and types of peoples that were living in the Ottoman Empire. As always, the Ottoman Empire is not just full of Turks. And in fact, the majority of the population was not Turkish speaking, and wasn't Muslim. So instead, there's other ways to think about, at the very least, the breakdown of peoples. And one of the most useful ways to look at it is language. So instead of always going back to the question of religion, it's also useful to think about language and what languages do people speak and what kind of communities do those make. So let's start off with the basic ideas. If we were to think about the type of languages that a person might have known around 1600 in the Ottoman Empire, most of you would probably say Turkish and Arabic, and that's what, when I teach this class live, most of the students say. But then there's all sorts of other languages that are commonly used, basically depending on one's ethnic or religious background. For example, Greek and Armenian, Slavic, Syriac, Hebrew, Ladino, Kurdish, and more importantly, Persian. Now, not all of these were necessarily written down. They didn't have the same equal prestige or usage. Some of them were just oral languages, like Kurdish, for example. Others were perhaps just written down, but not actually spoken, like Coptic. So we have here a set of different visions of language than we do today in our sort of nationalistic model of language usage, in which a people is tied to an area, and that people should all be speaking the same language from birth and being taught it at school. In fact, often what you might be taught in the course of your education in the Ottoman Empire was not the language that you were speaking at all. You weren't just learning to speak and then learning to read the written version. You were often learning to read an entirely different language than what you were speaking. Now, let's just basically begin with what language did educated Muslims know. And it's most commonly said that they knew what is called the Al-Sana al-Thalisa, the three tongues, the three languages. This would be Turkish, Arabic, and Persian. And ideally, a very educated person in the Ottoman Empire, such as yourselves, if you were living 340 years ago in Istanbul, would be able to function, or at least get by, in most of these languages. Now, this didn't mean that each of these languages was used for the same thing. It's not like you were expected to be completely fluent to be able to speak and to engage in these languages in the same way. And in fact, each of them had a different purpose. So we'll get into that in a second. But one of the things I want to point out is they all have the same alphabet, right? So just as French, English, and German have the same alphabet today, that is the Latin alphabet, but are different languages. These are different languages, actually radically different language families. Persian is Indo-European, Arabic is Semitic, and Turkish is Altaic. But they're written in the same alphabet, that is the Arabic alphabet at the time. Let me just pause this for a second. So let's get into the details of it. Each of these languages had a different purpose. Ottoman Turkish was the language of government. This was a language that would be spoken and written in government orders, usually, especially if they were being circulated in Anatolia and the Balkans. And initially, it was not the language of the state, right? The language of government, originally, at least in the period of the Seljuks of Rome, let's say between 1100, 1200, 1300, was Persian. Turkish was actually the language of these nomads that were coming in. And once they settled down, they usually ended up hiring Persian-speaking governors or administrators. And so therefore, most of what people were writing in was actually in Persian. If they were writing something religious, you'll see they were writing in Arabic. And so Turkish was actually more of a spoken language that became a written language and formalized over the course of the 15th and 16th centuries. So 1400s and 1500s. Turkish today, Ottoman Turkish, is different from the Turkish spoken, let's say, and by different Central Asian peoples. So, for example, if you speak modern Turkish, the Turkish of Turkey, it's slightly different from that of Azerbaijan, It's quite different from that of, let's say, Kazakhstan or Turkmenistan or Uyghur, all of which are Turkic languages. But you can kind of, if you understand Turkish well, you can kind of get the gist of them. But especially if you read them, but they're different languages ultimately, just as French and Italian, Spanish and Romanian are different languages of the Romance language family. And Turkish, because Ottoman Turkish, which was basically modern Turkic written in Arabic script, as I pointed out, started being used as a language of government in the 13th and 14th century. They started using informal orders. And then over the course of the 15th and 16th century, it became tied to something, it became kind of formalized. It became associated a bit more with high culture, with the court. It became a language in which you could write fancy poetry in. But at the same time, it was also the language of everyday people in the streets. And there was a big divide between the courtly language, the language you'd find in orders, which was very elaborate and what we might call highfalutin, centered on lots of borrowings of words from Arabic and Persian, versus the common language you'd find in the street, which is actually remarkably similar in many basic ways to the Turkish spoken today. And now, because this is the language of the street, it was also the language that all sorts of people, whether or not they were Muslims, were speaking in major cities in the Ottoman Empire, in Anatolia and the Balkans. So if you were in Thessaloniki, or if you were in Izmir or Konya, etc., whether you were a Jew or Christian or a Muslim, you'd probably be speaking day to day on the street Turkish. While you would have also your own tongue that you might use at home. And of course, people who interacted less in public, for example, women who might have just interacted with other women folk or just gone to the market, probably had much more basic Turkish than that of men. But even the men would probably only have, if they were not native Turkish speakers, basically be able to understand basic stories, negotiate in the marketplace, buy things, explain things to people, but they're not going to be able to, have a scientific discourse in Turkish or anything like that. And that's because ultimately there were other languages, as we'll see, that were meant for those types of usages. Now, if you look at the Turkish written today in Turkey, it is no longer in the Arabic alphabet. And that's because Ataturk Mustafa Kemal, the sort of father of the Turkish nation in the 1920s, who kind of ended the Ottoman Empire and started the Republic of Turkey, essentially abolished the Arabic alphabet because he saw it as backwards and unscientific. And he forced everyone in the country to essentially learn an entirely new alphabet for the language. Now, Arabic and Persian remained the same. They continue to be written in Arabic alphabet, but Turkish is, and the same goes for Azeri today too, is written in a Latin alphabet. But he went further than just switching alphabets. And you can imagine just by switching alphabets, it was already a major thing. Imagine all of a sudden and having to no longer be able to read in English using the Latin alphabet, but going for the more rational and more precise, Hangul alphabet of Korean. So if you were to switch to the Korean alphabet, you wouldn't be able to read, at the very least, for a while. And when you would read, you'd be reading slowly. It was a sort of infantilizing move by the government, by Ataturk, to reimagine and re-render people in the new nation of Turkey. But he went further than that. He also basically removed a whole bunch of different words. He took out words that were from Persian and Arabic, and he replaced them, not him personally, but through a sort of grassroots campaign of newly invented Turkic words, often looking towards ancient or very old Turkic nomadic groups, etc. And so transformed basically the nature of the language heavily, replacing maybe, 40 to 50% of the vocabulary. And that process continued. So if you were to read Turkish from 1920s to 30s, it would basically be unintelligible, relatively unintelligible, to a non-educated person in Turkey. And it changed rapidly between it would be different between 1920 and 1960. And the Turkish in 1960 is quite different from the Turkish spoken today. Unlike English, which I think you could still basically understand English written 1960, just as you can probably understand the English written in, the 1850s, even though there'd be different words and different, it might be more ornate. And in fact, to cement this, it was actually made illegal until essentially 1890s or 80s to use Arabic script in public. On the right here, on the left, we see Ataturk kind of introducing the new alphabet. And on the right here, we see an attempt to show why this new alphabet is better. These three words, gul, which is rose, gel, which is come, and kel, which is bald, are all spelled the same way in Ottoman Turkish because it's not quite phonetic. And so it's trying to show that you can actually spell them differently in a phonetic manner. But let's move on from Turkish. Now, Turkish was basically the language of everyday usage of the government, but there was another language that was used for questions of science, for law, and for religion. And that is Arabic. And that's because Arabic is ultimately the language of the Quran. The Quran, the revelation given to the Prophet Muhammad, is not meant necessarily to be translated. Just because you translate the Quran doesn't mean it's exactly the same Quran. It's basically a version, a commentary on the Quran, but the Quran itself has to be in Arabic. And so therefore, there's always been a heavy emphasis on knowing the Quran in the original Arabic. And for many years, Arabic was essentially the universal language, was the language of knowing and engagement with all sorts of knowledge. And basically, the way that Latin was in medieval and early modern Europe until about 1750. You had to know Arabic in order to know any science or to do any sort of larger theoretical discussion. And moreover, in the Arab lands, so basically, Syria and Egypt and Iraq and so forth, this was a language that also used every day. Now, there's a big difference. There's what we call a diglossia between Arabic spoken every day and the Arabic used for writing and purposes. And in fact, we speak about colloquial Arabic, which is different from each country, to the shared written Arabic, which is basically the same across the Arab lands. But you would never speak the written Arabic. It's not really used for anything more than to share ideas in writing. So the same goes for the Ottoman Empire. So if you were a scholar living in Istanbul, you might be speaking Turkish, but when it came down to doing law, when it came down to doing to writing a theoretical treatise about science, when it came to anything more formal, especially related to religion, you would probably be writing in Arabic. And a lot of people did know Arabic because that's how you learn to read, right? You would never learn to read just Turkish. You learn to read basically the Quran first. And then you applied some other things, and you applied those skills to Turkish, right? Because they're the same alphabet, but there was never formal Turkish classes. You would never go to a school and learn Turkish. You just learned Arabic, and then you kind of used that knowledge of the alphabet to basically read Turkish. Finally, there was a third language that educated Muslims knew, and that is poetry. That's Persian, which was a language of poetry. It was a language of high culture in the same way that maybe French was until 100 years ago or 80 years ago. This was the language that you had to know if you were going to be a secretary, if you were going to show off that you're a cultured, artistic person, and especially if you're, again, attached to certain types of religious groups like Sufis, as I'll talk about. As we said before, Persian was already the language of government in the medieval Middle East because there was a lot of Persian-speaking secretaries and bureaucrats, etc. And initially in Anatolia, that was the language that was being used. But as Turkish kind of developed and became the language of government, its use in formal government apparatus was minimized, except diplomacy and things like that when they needed to speak to other Persian-speaking kings. But at this point, it remained basically the language of poetry, and eventually became associated with a certain group with more educated, urbane secretaries and bureaucrats rather than, let's say, the madrasa, the lawyers and professors that are being trained in the university. Now, it's all well and good for basically an educated Muslim, but an educated Christian, and again, Christians were probably the majority of the population until at least 1515 or 1550, when the Ottoman Empire took over the Arab lands and basically acquired a much larger Muslim majority. The language of educated Christians was often Greek. This was the language, of course, of the Byzantines themselves, and the Byzantine Empire was the imperial language. It was the language of which the Bible was translated into. And it was the language for basically all Orthodox Christians who were using it for all sorts of religious and scientific and general discussions. And it was also a language spoken every day by Greek-speaking Christians throughout the Ottoman Empire, whether they're found in Anatolia or in the Balkans. We find people speaking Greek. So what that meant is that if you were a Slavic speaker, you would, if you wanted to become educated and you were, a Christian, you would basically often end up having to go to school and learning Greek and possibly less likely Latin to learn how to function and move in these worlds. So there's actually multiple dialects of Greek. There's basically different groups that were speaking Greek in different ways, and this reflects the different Greek populations. There's basically one group here in central Anatolia, another type of Greek in the northern coast, what's called the Pontic region, and then also one that basically stretches along the Mediterranean Black Sea coast from the centered in Istanbul. That said, even though there was multiple forms of Greek, Greeks often spoke Turkish. And sometimes that was basically their first language because that was the language that you were speaking on the street day to day. And in many households, especially by the 20th century, this was just the language that you spoke. And in fact, if you look at Greek names and sometimes Armenian names, you find Turkic surnames based off of occupations and so forth there. But it's also true that a lot of Muslims spoke Greek. And why is that? It's because there's significant populations of Greek speakers that converted to Islam and continued to speak Greek. This happened most often in the island of Crete and also in places like in Epirus, which is basically northwestern Greece today. This all came to a head in 1923 in a thing called the Mubadele, which is basically the exchange. After the failed war of Greece to try to take over parts of Western Anatolia, it was decided that Christian subjects, that Greeks were no longer loyal members of the Turkish nation. And the same thing had happened in Greece, where there'd been a much longer set of wars. First a war of sort of independence and invention of the nation, and then a set of expansions would continuously pushed out Muslims living in Greece. And there is a forceful transfer of Christians and Muslims between the two countries. So 1.5 million Christians left the now Republic of Turkey and went to Greece, and 0.5 Muslims were transferred out of Greece and into essentially Anatolia. Often, as I pointed out, these Christians were Turkic speaking, so they had to learn Greek as a spoken language. And many of these Muslims were also Greek speaking themselves. So there's certain areas in Turkey where, for example, Cretan Muslims who were Greek speaking ended up settling down and continued to speak Greek. Outside of Greek, though, there was, if we were to go into the kind of southern and middle Balkans, there's usually a Slavic language spoken. These were often not written. If they were written, they would be written in a variety of different alphabets. Sometimes they've been written in Arabic, called Al-Hamiado, which you can see here. This is supposed to be a Bosnian text written in Arabic script, but it could also be written in Cyrillic or Latin scripts. And in fact, today, for example, you have Serbian, which is Serbo-Croatian, written in Cyrillic, whereas in Croatia, it's written in the Latin script, and in Bosnia today, written in the Latin script, but there also existed for a long time in the Arabic script. And then we have other languages that are not Slavic, for example, Albanian and Romanian, which were never formally written down often. And when they were written down, we're going to give mixed alphabets. So again, keep in mind the connection in alphabet and script, alphabet and language is not necessarily straightforward. These would often be languages, again, spoken in the countryside and spoken between both Muslims and Christians, often because we have all sorts of Christians, Slavic-speaking Christians converting to Islam. Kind of the last language spoken by Christians is Armenian. Armenians are basically a separate ethnic group living in Eastern Anatolia, but then migrating to all sorts of different areas, which forced to migrate and migrating and fleeing from different attacks and banditry, and settling in different parts of the Ottoman Empire. And they had their own language, which was quite ancient, and they're one of the first communities to convert to Christianity back, well, in, I don't know, 2nd century, 3rd century. And so Armenian was used heavily, but many Armenians, again, knew Turkish. They were reading literature in Turkish. And in fact, there's even a sort of Turco-Armenian language, which I think I have on the next page. No, but you would read this. This is in the Armenian alphabet, but it would be in Turkish, right? So that's called Armeno-Turkish. And this was pretty common because most Armenians, after settling down in major Ottoman cities, ended up becoming Turkic-speaking and using formal Armenian only for, I don't know, letters or liturgical purposes, etc. But every day, reading and writing, they would read in Turkish, even if that Turkish was written in the Armenian script. And as I pointed out, like Greeks, many Armenians have Turkish surnames. So if you find someone called Kebabjian, it means kebabci is someone who makes kebabs or sells kebabs. And so Kebabjian is the way of saying the kebab seller's son. Finally, there's also languages that Jews spoke. Of course, Hebrew is the traditional language of Jews, and to a lesser degree, Aramaic. And this was the language that people would learn to, read text and to engage with the classical heritage. So basically the same way that Christians might know Greek, or to a lesser degree Armenian. But they could, again, use the same alphabet, the same Hebrew alphabet, and basically write any language. And so we have a lot of what we call Judeo-Arabic or Judeo-Turkish texts. This one, for example, is a Turkish text written in the Hebrew alphabet. In this case, it's a heresiography. But as I pointed out in the last class, many of the Jews at the time also had migrated from Spain after the expulsion of the Jews from Iberia. And so the language that they were speaking day to day, and some of their literature was actually being written in Spanish, which is basically called Ladino, Judeo-Spanish. You would basically write it in, again, Hebrew characters, but it'd be a Spanish words, often with a lot of extra Turkish mixed in. And in fact, people were constantly mixing and matching these words. This is a diary, a set of songbooks kept by an Ottoman Jewish soldier named Leon Bahar. So you can see while he was serving in the military during the Balkan Wars in 1912, 1913, he was writing in both in the Hebrew alphabet, Ladino Hebrew alphabet, and also in Ottoman Turkish, because he had at this point gone to school. So one thing to keep in mind in all these cases, what's the relationship between language and identity before the time of nationalism? Was it possible for an empire-wide discussion to occur? So could all of these people, all these different people living in the Ottoman Empire actually speak to each other? Well, sometimes they could, sometimes they couldn't. If they were living in a big city, they could speak in Turkish, but again, the level of Turkish was probably pretty basic. And on the level of, listening to stories or haggling at the marketplace, but not at a sort of high cultured level. And in fact, we don't see much translation, for example, going between Greek and Turkish. You don't see lots of different Greek texts being translated constantly and being discussed in Turkish, etc. And in fact, different languages ended up taking on different cultural roles. And as we saw in Persian and Arabic, each one had its own space and responsibility. And the same occurred with Christian languages. Greek was the universal learning language, but everyone might have spoken different languages at home, whether that was Arabic, Slavic, or spoken forms of Greek. So with that, I will end it. Thanks for listening.